Now we had an excellent possibility to hear two distinguished guest speakers, two men whom I consider to be real inspiring persons, somebody whom I value very much because they had personal courage and bravery and ability to assess, independently own life crossroads and decide in an unexpected direction. In the way where it's very difficult, Dave did a choice which is a huge inspiration, and we may start to discuss about that. I'm pleased, it's my pleasure to welcome Mike Haines from Scotland and Hanif Qadir from UK, who will be focusing on their experience in overcoming violence. Because we'll be focusing on these personal stories, we'll try to have a kind of close, short, intimate dialogue in front of 100 people, which might be not so easy, but let's try to do that. I was impressed when I was looking on the videos and the articles which you wrote, because you were describing your experience, and it's not any theory, any statistic, it's your experience. So I think that we'll give you for 15 minutes to Hanif and 15 minutes to Mike, and after that we'll put a little bit more questions, and after that we'll give the floor to the audience. Hanif, would you start, please, and would you be so kind and describe your crossroad and your experience, something which was happening like 15 years ago already, but it has consequences now?
Absolutely. Can you hear me okay? So it was about in 2002, I wasn't from a background that was marginalized. I wasn't from a deprived background. And I wasn't a young person. I was young, but not a young guy. In 2002, a year after the 9/11, I'm pretty sure that we can never forget that date, we saw 3,000 people killed by people who claimed to represent my faith. As a Muslim, it was sad to hear that so many people were killed because of what they did. Shortly afterwards, we hear the rhetoric from George Bush. Obviously, his country has been attacked. People have been killed. There is going to be some anger and some frustrations, but the war on terror was launched, and it gained a lot of support from around the world. My country, the UK, other countries got involved in the war on terror. And that meant that the invasion of Afghanistan was imminent. So 19 people who were from the Middle East, because of what they did, Afghanistan was the major target. To a degree, I understand, but for a handful of people in comparison to a whole nation, bombing that country into the Stone Age wasn't the right kind of response. And the reason why that wasn't the response, because people like me and millions of others, when you saw the death toll increase, and it wasn't just about the combatants, it was about innocent civilians. Hundreds of thousands of innocent women and children were killed. And we saw those images on our TV screens on a daily basis. And as a human being, put my faith to one side for a minute, as a human being, if we don't feel sad and emotional about the loss of life of young children, women, and elderly people, then we have to check ourselves. Are we really that human? And I was no exception. I felt really sad about that. I was very angry. I was very emotional about that. It wasn't that I didn't agree or I agreed with 9/11. Obviously, this was a sad moment in history. But when the rhetoric of the war on terror changed to the crusade, People were saying this is a war against evil. In the name of Jesus Christ, we will defeat our enemies. It became obvious to people like me and others from my community that this was a holy war. It was a religiously motivated war against Muslims. The level of death in Afghanistan of women and children was unprecedented. I've always been a humanitarian. I was in business. I was very successful in business. I knew a lot of people in my community, and I was approached by many people to support the victims in Afghanistan, and which I had no problem with. So I started to donate money, raise funds, to raise food items and packages to help those innocent people in Afghanistan. My role with these individuals that came to see me started from there. It wasn't difficult to approach me. It wasn't difficult for me to accept the fact that what they are trying to do is something most human. And as a Muslim, I felt obliged, that is my role, to get involved. Just like you see the images today of Syria, it was like that in 2002. Over the months, my meetings with these guys were very secretive. It came to a point where I saw American soldiers standing over the bodies of young children with a gun in their hand, smiling. I saw the testimonies of young Afghan kids who were sexually abused by American soldiers. I saw women, I saw children who lost their families because American soldiers got so high on drugs that they started killing innocent villagers. These are facts you can't deny. And if you think that these are the things that radicalize people, then you're right. Because it pulls on your humanitarian codes, your emotions. And it's not very difficult to fall foul of the agendas behind certain people. You can see from the meetings that I could see from the meetings that I had that it was something that ordinary people should be doing, so why shouldn't I? Within 8 months' time, it came to a point where I wanted to stop these killings. And the only way that I felt that I could do that was to go there myself. So I went to Afghanistan on a humanitarian basis, but also to fight, to stop the killings by Americans and by Allied forces. The problem with that is I'm not going to talk away from the facts that I saw before I went or whilst I was there. Atrocities were happening by Americans and Allied forces, sometimes deliberately. But then, what people like me don't see is when you get on the ground, I expected shock, I expected awe, I was going into a conflict zone. But what I did not expect was the people that I was going to support to stop this killing of innocents were also involved in using innocent children to become suicide bombers. At a time when it was unimaginable, unthinkable, that young children would be targeted by a civilized world, but also by those who claim to act in the name of my faith, Islam, which completely goes against killing innocent people, especially children. But these individuals, especially foreign fighters that were involved in Afghanistan, it wasn't mainly Afghan people. It was the foreign fighters that came from across the world to help fight against the West that were instrumental in recruiting and identifying those young people to become suicide bombers. In front of my eyes, I saw kids who were being measured, and I thought the funds that we are sending, the support we are giving them, this is for their clothing. But then you see the smiles on the kids' faces. You see them smiling, and you ask them, how are you feeling? And they say, we're feeling good because we're going to paradise. We're going to meet our families. And we're going to take all of our other families with us in a place where everything is going to be sweet. We're going to have everything we want. These were the stories that were told to the kids. It's true, when you go to heaven, everything is there for you. But these kids who lost their parents, lost their families, it was very easy to recruit them. Because who did they lose their families and who was their perpetrators? It was the Americans, it was the British. So for them to get involved and to have this dream of going to paradise and to meet their parents and to make everything safe was very easy to convince them. But they didn't know. And when I asked the question, do they know what they're going to do? And they said they don't need to know that. They only need to know where they're going. And for me, that was not only worse than what the Americans and the British were doing, it was soul-destroying. Because I know my faith that didn't allow that. And when you ask the question is that, well, the Americans have got drones, they have missiles, they have airplanes. God has given us these children to be our defense, to fight the enemy. I had two choices there. Either I fight and turn a blind eye to what I just saw, or I fight these guys who are abusing the children. For the reason I went there was because of the loss of life of children. And for the same reason I left there is because the same people who I went to support were using those children. And the third choice I had was to either fight them and get killed. The final choice was to leave and try to stop this from happening. I won't go into detail about what happened and how I left. I was thankful and I was lucky to be alive, that I managed to turn my back on these people and return to the UK. On returning to the UK, I tried to educate our communities. This is in 2002, when homegrown terrorism was something that nobody accepted could be a reality. We had 9/11, that was a unique incident. That's what everybody was saying. But my community, the Muslim community, didn't believe what I was saying to them. They thought I came back from Afghanistan with lots of drugs and I was smoking it. And I was too high to understand the reality. The fact was it was happening, but they didn't understand that. The police and the local authorities didn't understand what I was saying. Until 7/7, the tube bombings in London. That's when people started to accept that there's a problem. But further still, when you can't go on an airplane now with liquid, because of the liquid bombers. They came from my community. 14 young men from my local area were planning to carry out the biggest attack since 9/11. And that's when I think our communities and our police forces and our local authorities realized we have a huge problem. But shortly after that, there was a documentary produced, and I urge you to check that documentary. It's called The Children of the Taliban. And that showed that the Taliban were recruiting young children to become suicide bombers. When that documentary was released, I cried because now people would realize what I was saying wasn't wrong. I was telling the truth, and this is the facts. We look at today, and we look at what ISIS is doing by recruiting young children. It's nothing new. There have been extremists and terrorists of all kinds, have been doing it historically. But my role in trying to educate my communities and my local authorities started on a bad note because obviously they didn't understand what I was saying. Even the 7/7 attacks, even the airline plot, still didn't get the people to understand that the problem is within our communities and the solutions are also within our communities. So I started out in my work to try to solve this problem, to tackle this issue. To first educate my own community, and second to educate the government and the local authorities and other communities that this is the biggest challenge of our age. And that was in 2003, 2004, 2006, 2007, and going on. And today, in 2017, I don't think I'm wrong in saying that it's probably the biggest challenge of our age. And if we look at the rise of extremism from all walks of life, extreme right wing, here in Slovakia, in Ukraine, in Europe, in America, in UK, Islamic-based extremism is one thing, and they both feed off each other. So when you see an attack in Paris or in the UK, what is your position on that? When you see these guys are acting in the name of Islam, Or when you see the beheading of an individual, of a friend of mine whose brother was killed in Syria, when you see these beheadings, what are your thoughts? We as Muslims, the first thing that comes to my mind, and I work with thousands of young men and women across the country, the first thing that comes to their mind is, please God, I hope these are not Muslims. Why? Because the rise in extreme right wing, in populism, in division, is because the backlash that we will experience is unprecedented. And unfortunately, the backlash happens to the women first. Extremists will attack the weak first. And we now see these two beasts, these two monsters, who are feeding off each other. But they're feeding on our communities, on you and me. And it's a human resource that they're tapping into, that you, are allowing them to do so. And if we don't act, if we don't understand the different problems from different perspectives, if you don't understand how I felt, why I went to Afghanistan, if you don't feel the pain of somebody watching the atrocities in Syria, I saw a few tears when Sajida put this video on. It was a video of young children singing in a time of conflict. And it brought a few tears. Now, if you can put some images that have come out recently, since yesterday, the day before, of what happened in Syria with the chemical attack, I'm pretty sure that most of us will be shocked. And if I can't appreciate your pain, or if you can't appreciate my pain of what you see, then you're going to miss a trick. If I can't appreciate the pain or the anger of individuals in Slovakia or in Europe when they target Muslims, if I don't understand why they're doing it, then I'm always going to miss a trick. And it's always going to be the same. You have to understand what goes on and what are the underlying factors if we want to tackle this problem and if we want to create peace. Because if we don't understand the underlying factors, we are not going to get anywhere close to addressing the problem. And the problem is going to continue, and these monsters are going to consume you and us together. There is no neutralizing factor that's being done at the moment around the world. My job since I returned was to engage with young people. My job was trying to prevent extremism and terrorism, because I could see that if it continues, it could only lead to further chaos, further division, hostility and conflict. And in this time now, I think that the conflicts are spreading rapidly, well, they're more fluid than ever. Within the Muslim communities, you have the division of Shia and Sunni. This is a conflict that's been historically, embedded within it. It's causing problems all over the world now. We have other problems where Muslims are seen as the enemies in the Western world. I was born and bred, I was raised in the UK. My father went there in 1950. Am I British or am I something else? What is my identity? I know I'm Muslim, I know I'm British. But am I really respected in my country? Do I feel as if I've got a future in my country? I'm afraid that with the times going now and with the rise in hostility and hatred, I don't see. And I say this because I have worked with thousands of people, like I said before, and they feel the same thing. They don't feel that they have a stake in society anymore. They don't feel that they belong there anymore. And you know what? Extremists have been saying that for years to them. That because you are Muslim, you will never be tolerated. You will always be seen as the enemy. You will not be accepted until you follow and believe what they believe. And what do? What does Trump say? Le Pen? All the extremist groups, what do they say? They confirm that message. So that's what drives young men and women towards the extremist narrative. And if we don't understand that narrative, you can't produce the counter-narrative. Politicians from around the world, advisors ask me, What is the counter-narrative? You say, do you understand what the narrative is? Before I tell you what the counter-narrative can be? And a lot of them don't. But a lot of them say, well, we need to modernize Islam. We need to adopt a more European Islam, which is exactly what the extremists have been saying for decades. So everything that we do to tackle the problem is counterproductive because we're playing to the hands of the extremists.
We have to interrupt that here. Thank you. Thank you, Hanif, very much for this description of your personal journey. And we'll come back to the current situation, but thank you very much for describing what happened when the young Muslim man is almost recruited by Al-Qaeda and rejects to continue in these activities when he's witnessing the suicide, the child suicide bombers. And there is a lesson which you took for the next phases of your life, where you are doing excellent, very important non-violence promoting work, peace building work, educating work with the youth and the others, and participating in a lot of different efforts in quite difficult conditions in Britain. We'll come back to that later. So thank you very much for that introduction. And please, Mike, would it be so nice and describe your story and your experience where you've had this turning point of understanding the situation in a different way?
I'd like to thank the conference for the opportunity to speak here today. It is a real honour and a privilege for me to be speaking to such an important audience. I'd like to tell you of my experiences in dealing with violence and the effects of terrorism on my family. If I may, I'd like to give you a little background. On the 11th of March 2013, my brother David Haines, a humanitarian worker for the French NGO Acted, was in Syria. He was returning from a visit to a camp in Syria with his colleague Federico when their convoy was ambushed. David and Federico were dragged at gunpoint from their vehicle, beaten, and put into another car and driven off at high speed. That began 18 months of hell for David, Federico, and my family. My brother had always known that humanitarian work was dangerous. We had discussed at length many plans and scenarios, including kidnap, in case anything happened to him when he was away doing his work. We had even set up a code system using grammar and punctuation in an effort to pass information without the kidnappers knowing. We had discussed all sorts of very difficult questions, so I knew how my brother stood on many different issues, including ransoms. It was always planned that I would be the point of contact between the family and the authorities. For quite a length of time, we had no information from Syria. We had no contact, no demands or anything. We didn't know who had taken him or for what reason. We had only hope and prayer my brother would come home safe. The 18 months of his captivity were on my part filled with meetings and some pretty intensive training from counter-terrorism forces and negotiation specialists and the like. These meetings and training provided me with a very strong focus and a job to do mentality. It was only when hostages from different countries held with my brother had been ransomed and released that we did start to get information. We then knew the identity of the hostage takers. The group that had come into control of a number of hostages was ISIS, also known as Daesh, or preferably Daesh. We had tried many different ways of establishing contact to be met with silence. Then, on the 13th of September 2014, my brother was murdered and the video of his death uploaded to the internet. The newspapers, internet, television were full of the coverage of my brother's death. It was impossible to get away from it. Hoping to appeal against the backlash against innocent Muslim people, I recorded a TV broadcast the day after my brother's death. That began a road which has led me here to be here today on such an important conference, making new friends and meeting old ones like Hanif here. From the day after my brother's death, I have spent the past 2.5 years going by invitation to schools, mosques, churches, colleges, universities, conference, basically anywhere that will have me. I go to talk of unity, peace and tolerance. I try to fight the hatred that the extremists, hate mongers and terrorists of all types seek to sow in our communities. I have travelled from Afghanistan to Middle East to Europe and all over Britain and have invitations to many more countries. I have talked with world leaders, faith leaders, village elders, and more importantly with the youth of today in an effort to promote peace. No matter where I have travelled and who I have been greeted with warmth, compassion, empathy, and friendship. This past 2 months I have been on the road constantly and have seen me speak with many thousands of students in Britain, all across all cultures, faiths and backgrounds. I was in London, not far from the scene of the recent attack, which has left so many innocent people stricken by the effects of terror once again. I did a number of TV interviews and appeals for calm after the incident. Almost straight away after the attack in London, the far-right elements in Britain were calling for retribution against Muslim people in Britain. I, along with Brendan Cox, launched a new campaign, #HopeNotHate, on the night after the attack, the aim of which was to unite people, no matter race, colour, religion, politics, culture, against hatred. The campaign has been shared, talked about and seen by over 130 million people. In Britain at this moment, people are coming together to speak out with one voice against hatred and terror. Here in this beautiful country, and the many countries represented here, it's time for all people, all races, all colours, religions to unite and stand against terrorism in all its forms. It's time, ladies and gentlemen, to put down trifling politics, to put down petty issues. It's time to stand tall and proud and speak with one voice united that we believe in humanity, we believe in peace, and we will drown out the voices of hatred by calls and actions for peace. This conference is discussing how we meet with violence. I want to tell you a story of an Englishman who had grown up with hatred all his life, who had risen in the ranks of the far-right group, the English Defence League. He was a member of Combat 18, a neo-Nazi thugs who commit hate crimes and would do violence, if not worse, on any of you here who was not Christian, not British, not white. He had committed many acts of violence on innocent people. He was, in short, a horrible, nasty man covered in swastikas and hate tattoos. He was walking down the street in his hometown on a Friday afternoon. He saw 4 Muslim men leaving the mosque after their prayers in their robes, and he admits that seeing those men in their robes, he had planned to go up and abuse them. They had sat down outside a cafe and were enjoying the sunshine and the coffee. As he approached, something clicked in his head, and instead of the abuse that he intended, he asked a question: why do you pray 5 times a day? Turning and seeing this man in t-shirt and jeans with hate tattoos, swastikas on his arms and body, you could have understood if their reaction had been one of hostility. Instead, they asked him to sit, and they answered his questions. From that point, they met every 2 weeks, and he learned. He has now had his hate tattoos removed from his body. He has left Combat 18. He has left the English Defence League. He now works for peace. If a man like that can change, anyone can. One of my own personal success stories, again, involved someone from the far right. He was a young man still at school, although he rarely attended. He was known to the Prevent Strategy section of the police in the UK. He had been in trouble with the police and arrested on a wide range of charges a great deal of times. He regularly took drugs and alcohol. He was 15. For some reason, he attended his school the day of my presentation, late last year. He was present during my speech, although I did not know of him at the time. He had gone home from his school and talked with his mother about my talk. The next day he went to school, and every day after that. He has stopped drugs and alcohol. He has not He has not been in trouble with the police since. He has stopped his acts of hatred. He has, in short, turned his life around. He has even started a group up within the school to promote peace, tolerance, and understanding. I only came to learn of this after his mother had sent a letter to my campaign telling me of his turnaround and thanking me for it. Another time, the authorities had become aware that a young man had planned to go to Syria to fight for Daesh after he had been radicalized online. Instead of the police going in with heavy boots and arresting him, I was asked if I would spend some time with him and just to talk with him. I spent many hours with him, and to cut a long story short, his plans changed. He has gone back to his family life, and he no longer glorifies the likes of Daesh. The non-violent approach to hatred, terror, and such like is the only way that works. If you face fear with fear, hatred with hatred, violence with violence, then you will only receive what you give. I'm not saying that the peace approach is easy. It is not and never will be. However, it is the only route that proves our humanity, and in this current world climate with so many problems, it is vital that we combat all hatred, all terrorism, united as one. Thank you.
I'm impressed because in a way, my understanding is that you are in a way continuing in your brother's mission of trying to focus and feel and care about the people who are in need and who are stressing the nonviolence. You both are excellent examples which are a little bit surprising because the usual answer to the violence and hate is just the retribution, the tendency to continue in the same mode, and your response is quite different. Your last idea that if we face fear with the fear, and hatred with the hatred, and violence with the violence, so we'll receive only what you give. I think that you both are stressing this idea, and in your everyday practical activities, you're able to visit youth clubs, schools, and churches, and mosques, and cultural places, and sometimes even going together jointly. What is this where you've been able to unify your tune? How it is possible? One is Muslim, one is Christian, both have different story, background. What is this, what is unifying you both?
I think from my perspective, what unifies us both is we both care about the future. We both care about our our young people, our countries. And it's very easy for me to continue in my path of, blaming the West for everything and blaming the non-Muslims for all the problems in the Middle East. It's very easy for Mike to say, I will never ever speak to a Muslim, I will hate all Muslims because of what they did to my brother. It's very easy to do that. The challenge is that by doing that, whose agendas are we serving? Whose purposes are we feeding? What is the outcome going to be? So the greater challenge for me is to remain focused on the work ahead, the intention to create a bridge between this hatred. We look at what happens with the terrorist acts. François Hollande, when Paris was attacked, what did he say? We are going to be merciless and pitiless when we launch our attacks in Raqqa. Raqqa is a place where extremists exist, but the majority of Raqqa is civilians. So he was radicalized. It takes somebody like Mike and like me to go in to talk to people and give them a bit of an awakening. I'm pretty sure Mike, when he goes and talks to, I've seen it, when he come to our youth center to talk to young people, they were silent and the response was in tears. Anybody who had a notion of violence or to go to Syria or to join extremists changed their mind immediately. When we talk to them, it's providing them with an alternative story, an alternative voice.
Mike, what unites you?
The thing that really, really unites us all is by acts of terror. They don't care about the victims. They didn't care about my brother. He wasn't murdered because he was a VIP. He wasn't murdered. He wasn't murdered because he was white, because he was Christian or a humanitarian worker or anything. What they wanted was for me and my family to stand up and point a finger of blame at a people and religion. They wanted my family to spout hate. So one of the things that unifies us is we come from different backgrounds, experience great different lives. The one thing that really unites us is that desire, that motivation, that urge to stand against all hatred. I don't point the finger at ISIS, Daesh. I don't point the finger at Combat 18, for instance. I talk about all hatred. And one of the things that I have seen through my work with Hanif and his organization is the strength of our young people today. This past few months, I think it is well over 20,000 students that I have talked to the past 2 months, and across all faiths, across all backgrounds, cultures. And I am seeing this determination that I first saw in Hanif's organization with his young people. That determination that we have had enough. It doesn't matter where a terrorist attack occurs. It doesn't matter the so-called reason. What matters is our reaction. And certainly I am pretty sure, and I have spoken to students in Europe, and have seen that same uniting across faith backgrounds, that we have had enough and that we need to speak for peace.
Mike, you have the badger with the campaign which you initiated, Hope, Not Hate. And Hanif, you have in front of yourself the book which you wrote about your transformation and lessons from that. May you say a few words, both of you, about the main idea in the book? Why you wrote that, and what is the main message, and what is the main message of the campaign? Why is it so successful? Can you say a few words about the book?
So, I'll talk about the book in 1 second, but has anybody heard of the Not in My Name campaign? Anybody who hasn't? Hands up, who hasn't? Get a life, sir. And it might take a few minutes. The concept behind the Not in My Name campaign. Many people in my community, the Muslim community, said, whenever there's a terrorist attack by Muslims, why do you have to apologize? And I said, we are not apologizing. We are standing in defiance to the narrative and the ideology of extremists of all walks of life. Especially from the Muslim perspective, we are saying, don't act in the name of our faith, because that is not Islam. Not in my name. We launched that campaign shortly after Mike's brother was murdered. And that campaign was so strong, it united people from right across the world. And we didn't know, but the Americans told us, and the BBC, that you have reached in excess of 300 million people, and there is not a nation on the earth that didn't follow the campaign. A young female who escaped from ISIS is currently in prison in the UK with her child. She escaped. The first thing she said to the security services in the UK was, I want to speak to Hanif from the Active Change Foundation. And they contacted me. They said, we feel like you might be at risk here. So they asked her further, said, these people who launched the campaign, I was in Raqqa amongst these guys who were running around angry, frustrated that they couldn't find a way to damage the campaign or to even hijack it. It actually made them angry and frustrated them. A simple campaign. So that shows that small things and small campaigns, small efforts do make a difference. And the reason why I've written the book was not to become rich and famous. I was rich. I wasn't famous before I started my work. Before I went to Afghanistan, I had everything in life that, I had a business, I had a Rolls Royce, everything I had. And I think what a waste of time in my life. But when I came back from Afghanistan, I used my own resources to fund our own work. Why? Because governments didn't understand, communities didn't understand what we were trying to say. So we showed them by using our own funds to do the work. So it wasn't about making money. This was about educating people. And I'm not an academic, you may have already noticed. But I've written my experience, my journey, the ins and outs of Al-Qaeda, the challenges, the underlying issues, and I've worked with some of the most highest risk cases in the UK, if not in the world. One of the guys was called Irhab 007, the world's most wanted cyber jihadist. I've worked with a number of high-risk cases, and the people that we've changed, it's in here. How, why, the failures. And one thing that's in the book, which I think was very, very important, that not governments, they don't listen to it, practitioners don't follow, especially from the Islamic perspective. What is the ruling on Islam about extremism? Well, in this book, I put the historical roots of extremism within Islam and the ruling of it. And that gives me, so whenever I work with an individual, I found that I don't need to use faith. I need to use an emotional, intellectual, and a cultural approach. But then faith is something that I have to use. When I was struggling sometimes with some of the more challenging individuals, like Mike said, some of the young people that you meet are very intellectual, and they do a lot of research, and they put a lot of questions to you, sometimes facts that you can't deny. But in the book, from my experience, from my own personal journey, I've learned that how we can provide the counter-narrative, how we can provide the counter-argument. Well, that's in the book. And I'll leave it to you guys to read if you want to. If not, good luck.
Yes, there is a big discussion that we cannot suppress the radicalization and extremism with the counter-radicalization campaigns. What is possible are the personal stories and emotional understanding. In one moment you wrote somewhere that we need to face the ideology not with ideology, but with theology and with the emotional empathy and ability to speak about that personal experience. What is the main reason for doing Hope Not Hate?
First, just say the Not in My Name campaign has actually spread. Initially, it was aimed at Muslim people making a stand, but it has now spread across all different cultures, different faiths, so people are uniting under that banner. There's only been in London, not far from the attack, the horror that you could see on people's faces. It was, and then almost straight away, within minutes, the far right calling for retribution. I had worked with Brendan Cox, Joe Cox's husband. Joe was a British MP that was murdered by a far right person last year. Brendan is a true inspiration and a real role model. He's a wonderful person. So we had spoken, and we had both seen this horror in the streets of London, and you could feel it spreading out throughout the UK. So we sat down, we came up with Hope Not Hate, and the idea is to cross all cultures. Our rallying cry is we stand united with one voice to drown out the voices of hatred. And again, we are now seeing that spread of campaign. It's all over from the very north of Scotland, Ireland, down to the south of England. But we're now seeing that message getting spread elsewhere. There was somebody, I don't no idea how they got the sticker, but there was somebody in St. Petersburg laying flowers with a Hope Not Hate sticker. And that, every terror attack hits my family and I hard, because we know there's innocent people that are going to suffer. We know that they're the families that have big holes in their lives. But one of the positives to come from this is that desire, that united, we have had enough. So I'm asking all of you to speak with one voice against hatred, against violence, against fear of any type. And that is the real guts of the campaign.
Thank you very much. Let's give a floor to maybe 4 or 5 questions from audience. So please announce and put the questions. We'll wait for the microphone.
Hello everyone. First of all, thank you very much for very insightful talks for both of you. My question actually goes for both of you actually, or whoever wants to answer to it. Why do you think that, despite of people like you advocating for a, let's say, a preventive approach instead of the reactive one that we're experiencing every day in the world, why do you think that the war on terror has changed so little after 15 years? Why do you think that the main approach is still like reactive, or like the security approach as they call it, instead of preventive? Thank you very much.
So, my work ever since I came back from Afghanistan has been focused on preventative, but also at the cutting edge of de-radicalization. This is my expertise, you can say. The problem is that this is risky business. And when governments, I'm not trying to attack any government here, but my job has been to try to advise and to help inform government on how to tackle the problem. Unfortunately, governments are bound by certain protocols and practices, and sometimes they like to be in a comfortable position. They don't like to take risks. This work requires some serious risks. When you're working with an individual who is on a journey to radicalization. Individuals are unpredictable sometimes. And when we are working with them, and if we are funded by the government, something can go wrong. And if it goes wrong, the government doesn't want to be any part of that. And because they don't want to be any part of that, they would rather choose to be on the periphery. So really not addressing the actual problem. And that's why the problem is increasing. The preventative work, it lies at the feet and at the heart of what Mike does when he goes into the schools and the colleges, and what we do on a daily basis when we go into the communities and in the schools. But sometimes, because we can't go into the depth of the problem because of policy, the problem will always continue.
Okay. Mike,
From my own experience, I work with people who are involved in the Paris attacks, people from Tunisia, the American families of the hostages that were killed, the British families, and there's still a British hostage in Syria, John Cantley. And in almost every case, the people who have been affected, the families, are standing up, are promoting peace, are talking about tolerance and trying to deal with the situation in a positive way. And certainly in my visits to the schools, you are seeing this same determination that students have to make a difference, to make a positive difference. And that is quite wonderful. There are so many, our papers, internet, television are full of voices for hatred. And when I first started, I thought I was one of very few people that were calling for unity, peace, and tolerance. And actually my journey this past 2.5 years has been quite enlightening, because I've been meeting amazing groups, organizations, Hanif and the Active Change Foundation, to just one of hundreds, thousands, people who are all making a stand, who are all trying to promote these values of humanity. But of course, they don't get the media spotlight. It doesn't take a special person. It doesn't take neither Hanif or myself are good people, brave people, or anything like that. We have just seen the effects that it has on our family. We've seen the problems that lie beyond it, and that the fact that every act of terror wants to commit more terror. They want an act, St. Petersburg. They want people to be, to fear, to be suspicious. So way that we fight this is by uniting, by fighting all hatred.
Great. Any other question? And please introduce yourself or your organization and put the question or comment.
Hello everybody, my name is Michael Hassan, Youth Without Borders from Germany. First of all, I would like to thank you, both of you, Mr. Mike and Mr. Hanif. And thank you for being such a good example of human being. First of all, I agree with you both that the more violence we use, the more violence we get. But the question is, don't you think that the social media in our time giving those extremists more powerful? And also for what Mr. Hanif has mentioned, what's going on, whether in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, and those countries, this old way of thinking, war, tanks, aircrafts, missiles, in order to finish, or in order to, how to say that, in order to vanish the extremists, don't you think that's completely wrong? Don't you think that we have to look for solutions out of this box, just like what you have mentioned here in your book, or education, or tolerance, and so on? And
okay, let's interrupt here. So what we may do if the social media give more power to the hatred?
The challenge, this is the greatest challenge, why it's the greatest challenge of our time. And unfortunately, the extremists use the 21st century technology to the best advantage, where countries that have developed these technologies don't know how to manage it. You know why they're effective is because, I'll give you one example. In Europe, there was a guy, I think he was the ex-director of the European Commission, he was sitting with me and he said, privately, I don't think that they have the skills to come up with these materials and these communication mechanisms. They are supported by some security force or some regime. And I said, the problem with you is that you underestimate the value and the skill of young people to use the technology. That's a challenge. But equally, we can counter that challenge by investing, and I would say this, I say this to all of the people that I meet across the world, all the leaders. We have to invest in those young people to apply the same skill set with the same technology to challenge this ideology and this issue, especially online. But don't be blindsided by the online techniques and tactics, because there's an offline recruitment drive as well. And that's also affecting our young men and women. And I just want to say about the fact where you talked about the campaigns, the bombing campaigns. And I wrote extensively in the book, if we don't understand about, like I said in Afghanistan, to kill the terrorists, you have to bomb the whole country. You're going to naturally create enemies. In Iraq, the weapons of mass destruction, how many hundreds of thousands of civilians were destroyed, burnt to a crisp by the Americans and the British? Didn't we expect any kind of retaliation when you didn't find the weapons of mass destruction? And these conflicts don't solve anything apart from create the problem. The war on terror, 15 years ago. Look at it now, 15 years later. It's multiplied 100-fold. And if we don't do anything tomorrow about what is happening in Syria, and I was tweeting this last night, when you see the bodies of children attacked by chemical weapons, if the same countries that would attack Afghanistan or Iraq for something far less, if they don't respond tomorrow or immediately to the atrocities committed by Bashar al-Assad in Syria, then fighting terrorism is going to be a far distant wish. It's not going to happen, because we are given the opportunities to the extremists and the terrorists. We're giving them a reason to attack us. So these are some things that we really, really need to look into and understand, and not just that, appreciate.
Mike, when you spoke yesterday, you mentioned that besides of the supportive feedback, you receive also some of the hate speech in your social media. Well, how you cope with that? Because that's...
The hate speech, I would say 75% comes from far right. The twice that I've been personally accosted was by far right. And although I'm supposed to pass all my hate mail on, there's only twice when I've had death threats come through. The way that I deal with it is I'm now on a hit list for Daesh. Yeah, that's good with me. I was told after the Help Not Hate campaign, I am now on the far right radar. Yeah, that's good with me. I was asked if I wanted protection people with me and if we would tone down the campaign. And I said, no, we ramp the campaign up. We do more, and there's no way on earth am I having protection people. It means that I am having a personal effect. It means that I am reaching them, the haters, the despoilers, the dividers. And you know what? That's good with me.
Perfect. Thank you. We have possibilities for the last two questions or comments, so please. And after that, you.
Yeah.
Mustafa Usha from Iraqi Kurdistan region. Thank you very much for your presentation. Well, I just have a question. Like normally, now ISIS is identified by the United Nations and most of the countries as ISIS, as they identify themselves. And this is itself is promoting encouraging the people to join them. When you say ISIS, Islamic State. So don't you think there should be an international law, maybe by the United Nations, to identify them under a different name rather than ISIS? So for example, Daesh is a good name to tell people those groups are they are not good guys, they are the bad guys. So in this case, will be like it's much better to discourage people from encouraging them. So this is my question. Don't you think there should be an international law to force countries and media to name them in a different name rather than what they identify themselves? Thank you very much.
It's a very good question, and the answer to that is not as easy, but it's more complex. And the problem is because not just is ISIS calling themselves that, and then the rest of the world is supporting that name. Some of them are saying Daesh, ISIL, whatever. But the problem is when international democratically elected leaders call this Islamic terrorism, confirms the fact what ISIS is trying to claim. When Trump says it's Islamic radicalization, Islamic extremism, when other people say that this is Islamist ideology, I have a problem with that, because the people that we engage with, the people that matter, the communities, one, they don't like it being referred to as Islamist, and in the book you will find that they are far from Islamic. And as you know, and if you look at the history of these extremists and you saw the alcohol drinking, the drug taking, these are not Muslims. So yes, we have a responsibility. We should define them as terrorists. Simple as that. If we put a faith to them, Joe Cox, the guy that's starting with, his wife was murdered by a right-wing terrorist. But the judge said, don't call him a terrorist, we're muddying the water. He's a murderer.
Yeah.
Call him what he is. Well, so is Daesh. So these are murderers, these are killers. But we refer to them as terrorists. The problem is that there's no cohesive message. There's no unified message. And you're right. There should be a governing body to say, let's call them terrorists.
Yeah. Simple
as that. Because if we don't, we are giving food and ammunition to them and other young people for recruitment. It's a simple game of mathematics.
Mike, do you want to add to that?
Certainly, I think there's a great role that the United Nations are playing, will play. But also you bring into, you have a governing authority, whether it's a government, whether it's United Nations, and they are saying, we will call them this. Daesh, for instance. And straight away we have elements of our youth. I was an angry young man. I flirted with the idea of communism. Safe in Britain, far from the actual realities, but I mucked around with the idea of communism. I was an angry young man. I had a beard when I was 13, so me and my mate used to go to the pub. That was our way of rebelling. But now you have the angry young men and women of today. They say, right, they're being called Daesh, but they're not. They're our role models. They're standing up against institutions, governments. And then you have the groomers, and I use that word on purpose. The way that people, the groomers, find our angry young men and women, and they twist them. They give them perceptions that are false. Their reality is made untrue. And if for whatever cause, whether it be for the far right, whether it be for Daesh or any other terrorist group, and it's them that we need to find. And I actually think thinking having international law, it does have positives, because as Hanif said, you would then have a cohesive approach. But also there is, we say in Scotland, swings and roundabouts. There's good and bad for it.
Okay, we have time for a short question and short answer.
Yes, I will put a very short question. I just follow the idea of not being able to counteract propaganda, what you said. And is my understanding it's about an alternative narrative. It is created through this campaign to make appeal to the things of emotion unite us. And my question is, if you use also identity and face in your book, as you said, but the same things are used by propagandists from Islamic Daesh, and where becomes, where starts a different message, and how this message became powerful. What have you added to become a popular and narrative?
Okay.
Thank you. I'm George from Romania. Thank you.
So we heard of the term alternative facts and fake news very recently since Donald Trump, yeah? Mm-hmm. Well, in fact, misinformation, alternative facts, and fake news has been inherently, embedded within extremist networks from history. When anybody wants to abuse somebody or recruit them, groom them, they always come up with alternative facts and fake news. And I've written about that extensively, about you leave the information with the community. If I say to you, all of you today, that there is somebody amongst you who the police are watching, who is a known pedophile, that information I just drop on you. I know your human nature will look around and check that, who is he talking about? Who should we be wary of? I'm leaving that to you to decide, because I know the human nature. So misinformation has always been effective. But facts, real alternative facts, when it cannot be challenged, are more effective. So the truth will always prevail. You know this. But the truth given in the right context, with the right kind of language that is communicated to all the people within the community that you're working with. So Daesh and all these, they understand the dynamics of our communities. They understand the hearts and minds of our communities. We don't. We don't take the time. They understand that. And because they understand that, they drop information and they will leave the people to believe what they feel inside. What our job is, and how I've put it in the book, and what my challenges were, when they come with these facts to me, I come with the alternative reality, which I leave them to decide. You choose now what you want to believe and what is reality, and allow them to make the decision. That's the way to do it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Hanif and Mike. Thank you very much for your ability to force us to think about important deep messages about the